Thomas Coulter had spent most of his adult life avoiding the land that made him who he was. The farm lay on the southern edge of Clay County, where the soil was dense and red, and the air smelled of iron and rain. When his father died nearly 2 decades ago, Thomas left, selling his share of the crops to distant relatives and swearing he would never come back. Yet now, at 50, the city had hollowed him out. He returned with little more than a rusted pickup, a few tools, and the quiet conviction that maybe the land would still recognize him. The farmhouse stood where it always had, crooked, weather-beaten, and still holding the stubborn dignity of its builder. Every window frame was warped from heat. The porch sagged on one side, and yet when Thomas crossed that threshold, the floor groaned like it remembered his name. The air inside carried that familiar scent of oil, wood smoke, and earth. He unpacked his few belongings, took a slow walk through the overgrown fields, and saw the same patterns of wind pressing down on the tall grass that he remembered from his childhood, as if nothing had changed, though everything had. The first days passed in near silence. He cleared debris, patched the roof, and spent long evenings in the shed working on the old Massey Ferguson tractor that had once been his father's pride. Its paint had long turned to rust, but the metal still held integrity. There was something deeply human in its resistance to decay. Each bolt he loosened and replaced felt like he was repairing not just a machine, but a memory. At night, the wind would move through the barn boards like a low voice humming an old tune, and he would sit by the window, watching lightning bugs drift across the grass, their light pulsing in slow rhythm with his own heartbeat. The neighboring farm belonged to Frank Delaney, a man Thomas had known only through his father's complaints. Frank was younger by a decade, sharp-featured, the kind of man who spoke in statements instead of sentences. His property stretched wide, lined with new fencing, and a barn that gleamed like a monument to precision. From the porch, Thomas could see it every evening, the roof shining like polished steel, the corners cut clean as if the whole thing had been designed to cast shadows on purpose. The border between their lands had always been marked by an old stone, waist-high and half-buried in weeds. As a boy, Thomas used to touch it like a relic, told by his father that it marked the boundary of their world. But now, when he went looking for it, the stone was gone. In its place, the soil looked freshly disturbed, like someone had dug deep and filled it back in. He stared at the barn on the other side, its wall running so close to the invisible line that the late afternoon shadow stretched onto his own field. That shadow unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it didn't matter, that neighbors built things wherever they pleased, that boundaries on paper meant less than they used to. But the feeling lingered, sharp as a splinter under the skin. One evening, as he was tightening the final bolts on the tractor's engine, the setting sun caught the side of the barn just right, and for the first time, he saw how the light bent, the slope of the hill, the lean of the fence, the subtle drift of land that now seemed to belong more to Frank than to him. It was as if the world had tilted slightly while he was away, shifting the line of inheritance by degrees until nothing fit as it once had. When he tried to shake the thought, he noticed something else. A line of footprints near the tractor shed, heavy and recent, ending where the grass flattened against the wheel tracks. He crouched down, pressed his fingers into the dirt, and felt the damp impression left behind by another man's boot. He glanced toward the barn again, saw the faint curl of smoke from Frank's chimney, and for the first time since coming back, he felt the cold flicker of unease. The farm, his father used to say, remembers everything. Every step, every trespass, every claim made on what's yours. And as the night settled in, Thomas wondered whether the land itself was trying to tell him that someone had already begun erasing his name from it. It happened on a morning that began like any other, the kind of morning that carried the smell of dew and diesel and the slow rhythm of a man trying to rebuild his days. Thomas woke early, poured himself a cup of coffee that tasted faintly of rust from the old kettle, and stepped outside to where the light spread across the field in a pale, steady wave. The air was cool, the soil damp beneath his boots. The tractor should have been there, parked beneath the lean-to beside the barn, a constant presence like an old dog waiting for its master. But as he rounded the corner of the house, the space was empty. At first he thought maybe he had moved it the day before and forgotten, some lapse of memory brought on by fatigue. He checked behind the shed, then down by the edge of the field, but the ground was smooth, undisturbed except for a faint indentation where the tires had rested. What caught his eye next was a trail of tracks, deep, heavy, unmistakably from his tractor, cutting through the soft earth and leading straight toward the neighboring property. The sight stopped him cold. The tracks passed through the grass, crossed the line where the boundary stone used to stand, and disappeared behind the gleaming wall of Frank Delaney's barn. The air was still, almost expectant, and for a long moment Thomas just stood there listening to the faint hum of insects and the distant caw of a crow, the quiet too absolute to trust. When he walked toward the barn, each step felt heavier, the sound of his boots muffled by the damp soil. He called out once, more out of politeness than belief that it would do any good, and then again, louder. There was no answer. The main doors of the barn were shut, secured with a thick steel latch that glinted in the sun. Through a narrow gap between the boards, he caught a glimmer of red paint, the exact shade of his father's tractor, dulled with time but unmistakable. His breath tightened, and for a moment, disbelief overpowered anger. He knocked on the door, then hit it with his fist, the hollow sound echoing inside. A few minutes later, Frank appeared from behind the barn, holding a bucket of feed, as if the whole scene were nothing but an inconvenience. His expression was unreadable, calm in a way that felt practiced. When Thomas asked what his tractor was doing locked inside another man's building, Frank didn't hesitate. He said it had been left unattended on his land, and that he had taken it in for safekeeping. The words sounded rehearsed, like a line drawn from some manual of property disputes. Thomas's voice sharpened, and he demanded that the doors be opened, that his tractor be returned. Frank simply leaned against the barn wall, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "That machine was sitting a good 10 feet over my line. You can't park on what isn't yours." Thomas stared at him, trying to process the absurdity, but Frank's tone remained smooth, even polite. He insisted that when he bought his property years ago, the boundary extended further east than the old maps showed. "You might want to check your deeds, Tom," he added with a half-smile that felt like a warning. "Things change. People forget where lines are drawn." The way he said it, quiet and deliberate, carried the weight of someone who knew he could twist the rules and make them sound lawful. Thomas felt heat rise behind his eyes, not just from anger, but from the sudden realization that he was completely unprepared for a fight like this. He had no recent survey, no lawyer, no allies, just an inherited belief that the land under his boots was his. When he stepped closer, Frank's demeanor shifted slightly. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. He just stood straighter, as if daring Thomas to take one more step. It was the kind of posture that said he was used to getting his way. After a moment, Thomas backed off, not from fear but from something deeper, a sense that the rules had already been rewritten, and he hadn't even seen the pen. He turned away, his hands trembling slightly, and as he walked back to his house, he could feel Frank's eyes on him the whole time. That night, the unease settled into his bones like cold rain. He couldn't shake the image of his tractor sitting behind those locked doors, silent and imprisoned, a piece of his past trapped in someone else's claim. He tried calling the sheriff's office the next morning, but the deputy on the line was cautious, polite in a detached way that said he'd heard worse. "If there's a boundary dispute," the man said, "we can't intervene until property lines are verified. Best get a survey done." When Thomas asked if that meant someone could just take something from his land and call it theirs, the deputy hesitated before saying, "Not exactly, but if the boundary's unclear, it gets complicated fast." It was the kind of answer meant to end a conversation. Thomas hung up and sat there, the receiver still in his hand, staring at the faded wallpaper on the kitchen wall where his father's old calendar still hung, the days long since expired. Later, he walked out again to the field, tracing the tire marks where they had sunk into the soil. He crouched and touched the ground. The indentations were still fresh, and when he pressed his fingers to the dirt, he found a small piece of metal, a broken tooth from the tractor's gear, proof that it had been moved roughly, carelessly. He pocketed it, feeling the weight of it against his palm like a promise. The sun was setting behind the ridge when he looked toward the barn again, the polished roof catching the last of the light, casting that same dark shadow across his field. He imagined the sound of the latch inside, the scrape of steel against wood, and the steady, patient silence of a man waiting for him to give up. But Thomas wasn't built for surrender. The farm might have forgotten his footsteps, but the blood in his hands still remembered how to hold on. Somewhere deep down, he knew that what had been taken wasn't just a machine. It was a claim to memory, a quiet theft of belonging. And as darkness closed around the edges of the land, he realized the true battle wasn't over the tractor. It was about the invisible line someone had dared to move while he was gone, and the kind of man he would have to become again to move it back. Thomas didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. Every sound outside felt like a presence. Every gust of wind against the siding made him imagine footsteps near the shed. The barn on Frank's land stood so close that its silver roof reflected the moonlight onto his field like a blade, slicing across the dark soil. By the 3rd morning, he decided he couldn't stand waiting any longer. He needed to prove what he already knew, that the land was his, that his father's field hadn't shifted an inch, no matter how many new fences or surveys someone waved in his face. He started with the oldest marker he could remember, the boundary stone, the rough hunk of limestone that had stood half-buried behind a patch of goldenrod since he was a boy. His father used to touch it like it was sacred, saying, "You measure a man by the line he keeps." Now there was only an uneven mound where it used to stand, a hump of dirt packed tighter than the surrounding soil, as if something had been buried there recently. Thomas fetched a shovel and began to dig, his hands trembling more from anger than exertion. The earth came up in clumps, damp and dark, smelling of iron and rot. He dug until the metal edge of the shovel struck something solid. It wasn't the limestone he expected, but a chunk of poured cement, gray and gritty, with a few shards of gravel embedded in it. When he brushed it off, he saw a clean edge on one side. Too clean, too new. Someone had replaced the old marker with fresh concrete, poured maybe months ago. He sat back on his heels, staring at it, the sweat cooling on his neck. Frank's barn wall loomed just a few yards away, so close that if Thomas leaned on his shovel, he could touch the shadow it cast. The placement wasn't accidental. Someone had erased the stone and built over it like sealing a grave. That realization hit him harder than any confrontation. It meant planning, calculation, the deliberate rewriting of a border. It wasn't theft by opportunity. It was theft by design. He stood there for a long time before returning to the house. The kitchen felt colder than usual, the silence heavy enough to make his ears ring. He pulled his father's old ledger from a drawer, a thick, leather-bound book where the old man had kept notes on every planting, harvest, and sale for nearly 30 years. In the back, written in a shaky but deliberate hand, was a map. It wasn't professional, but it was detailed enough to show every fence post, every creek bend, and the spot where the limestone boundary marker had stood, marked with a small X. The map ended precisely where the barn now began. Thomas felt something inside him tighten, a thin wire of fury stretching until it hummed. That evening, he drove into town, to the county recorder's office, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of dust and floor polish. Behind the counter sat a young man who looked more interested in his coffee than in anything Thomas might say. When Thomas explained what had happened, the clerk nodded absently, tapping at his keyboard. "Our system's digital now," he said. Most of the old survey records were archived back in the early 2000s. If you want copies, there's a fee. Thomas paid it without a word and waited as the printer spat out a handful of pages. The current parcel map looked sterile, all clean lines and parcel codes. The boundary between his land and Frank's was shown as a straight diagonal line that didn't match the angle he remembered. When he compared it to the drawing from his father's ledger, the shift was clear. His property had been shortened by nearly a full acre, the barn sitting neatly on the encroached portion. "This can't be right," he said, more to himself than the clerk. The man shrugged. "We update from what's filed. If a new survey came in, that's what gets recorded. You can dispute it, but you'll need a licensed surveyor to back you up." When Thomas asked who had filed the latest survey, the clerk scrolled and replied, "Delaney Holdings, filed 5 years ago. Looks legitimate." That word, legitimate, hung in Thomas's head like a taunt. On the drive home, the fields rolled past in shades of gray and gold, the fences dividing them like scars on the landscape. He thought about how easily a man could lose what his family had worked for, not through force, but through quiet paperwork and time. When he reached his property, dusk was settling in. He walked out to the field again, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The air was still, the kind of stillness that holds sound captive. Somewhere near the barn, he heard the faint creak of metal, followed by a dull thud. He stopped, heart hammering, listening. Then came another sound, something dragging, deliberate, heavy. He stepped closer, his hand tightening on the flashlight he carried. The beam caught movement for a second, a shadow passing behind the barn doors, and then it was gone. He didn't call out this time. He just stood there until the noise stopped, until even the insects fell silent. The next morning, when he went back to inspect the mound of dirt where the stone had been, he found boot prints around it. Not his own. They led a few feet toward the barn and vanished where the grass thickened. He crouched, studying them, noting the tread pattern. Deep, angular, identical to the ones he'd seen in the soil the day the tractor disappeared. That was when he understood that Frank wasn't just protecting a lie. He was guarding it. The barn, the cement, the erased boundary, everything was a fortress built on stolen ground. Thomas straightened slowly, feeling the weight of the discovery settle in his chest. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted or threatened. Years of working the land had taught him that quiet persistence outlasted noise. But this wasn't soil or weather he was dealing with. It was a man who thought ownership could be rewritten with a concrete mixer and a forged map. As he stood there, a faint breeze stirred the grass, and something metallic flashed near the base of the barn. He walked closer and saw, half buried in the dirt, the tip of an old fence wire, rusted but still strung tight. He followed it with his eyes as it ran beneath the barn's foundation, proof that the original fence had once marked a different line. He knelt, brushed away more dirt, and exposed another post stub, splintered and gray with age. His father's fence. His line. When he looked up, Frank was standing in the open barn doorway, arms crossed, watching him. Neither man spoke. They stood like that for nearly a full minute, the distance between them charged with something wordless, but sharp as a blade. Finally, Frank turned without a word and walked back inside, the door closing behind him with the soft, final sound of wood against wood. That night, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the old ledger open before him, the county map spread beside it, and the broken piece of fence wire coiled like a relic in his hand. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but one thing had become painfully clear. The fight had already begun, and he had entered it without realizing. The following week passed in a strange rhythm of exhaustion and purpose, the kind that eats away at a man's sleep, but sharpens his mind. Thomas woke each morning before dawn, unable to stop his thoughts from circling the same question. How could someone move a line so easily? And how many people had to look the other way for it to happen? The ledger, the missing boundary stone, the shifted map. All of it gnawed at him like an old injury. He decided to go back further than the county's clean digital records, further than the neat diagrams and convenient errors. His father had once told him that every piece of land carried two sets of history, the kind written in ink and the kind buried in dirt. Ink could be changed. Dirt couldn't. Thomas began searching through everything left in the farmhouse, opening boxes and drawers that hadn't been touched since the funeral. He found tax receipts, seed orders, handwritten notes about fertilizer ratios, even a folded newspaper clipping announcing a property division dispute from the 1970s. But what caught his attention most was a photograph, black and white and weathered at the edges, showing his father standing beside the same old boundary stone. The photo had been taken just after harvest, judging by the straw still clinging to his boots, and behind him, unmistakable even in grainy print, was a young ash tree no taller than a man. That tree, Thomas realized, was the same one that still grew at the edge of the field, now massive, its roots twisting through the soil like old veins. He remembered how his father used to joke that the tree was a better boundary marker than any stone, because it was alive and wouldn't be forgotten. That memory took root in him, sharp and sudden. The ash tree might be the only witness left. The next morning, Thomas drove into town again, this time to the small historical society tucked behind the library. The building was quiet, the kind of place that smelled of dust, varnish, and old paper. An elderly woman named Mrs. Kellum ran the archives, and she listened to his story with a slow, patient frown. "We've got some of the old plats on microfilm," she said finally. "They're not indexed, though. You'll have to look through them by year." Hours passed in dim light as Thomas scrolled through reels of faded documents, the numbers and names flickering across the screen like ghosts. When he finally found the one he was looking for, a survey from 1969, it showed his father's land with precise notes, including a reference to a living marker planted on the south boundary, labeled only as AF Ash Tree. He printed a copy and stared at it, the letters faint but legible. That small annotation meant everything. The tree was part of the original boundary record, legally recognized, alive long before any new survey lines were drawn. It wasn't much, but it was something no amount of cement or paperwork could erase. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, the kind that crawled over the hills and brought with it a smell of wet iron and pine. Thomas stood by the window, watching lightning carve thin cracks of light across the sky. He could see the ash tree in the distance, its crown thrashing in the wind, its silhouette swaying against the horizon like a sentinel. Rain began to hammer the roof, loud and unrelenting, and for a while he just listened, letting the sound steady his thoughts. But when the storm eased and the wind fell still, he heard another sound, a rhythmic, dull thud coming from the field. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, his boots sinking into the mud. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and earth. At first he saw nothing but darkness, then a flicker of movement near the tree. A flashlight beam darted once across the trunk and vanished. He shouted, his voice rough in the damp air, but whoever was there was already gone. When morning came, the ground around the tree was disturbed, the roots partially exposed as if someone had started to dig and then stopped. The bark bore fresh cuts, thin slices near the base, like someone had tried to mark it. Thomas knelt, tracing the grooves with his fingers, and felt anger tighten in his chest. He understood now. Frank knew about the tree. Maybe he had known all along. The next few hours blurred into a series of tense motions. He took photographs, wrote notes, and drove straight to a land surveyor's office in the next county, far enough away to avoid local politics. The surveyor, a middle-aged man named Hartley, listened in silence while Thomas laid out the situation. "If that tree's recorded as a boundary marker," Hartley said, "it's still valid unless the record was formally amended. A tree like that could anchor the line again. But I'll need to see it myself." They arranged to meet the following afternoon. When Hartley arrived, the late-day sun was low and pale, and the field smelled of wet straw. He took careful measurements, pacing the distance from the ash tree to the creek and back again, comparing it with the printed map Thomas had brought. After an hour, he looked up, his expression thoughtful but grim. "The tree's exactly where the old record says it should be," he said. "And that barn," he pointed toward Frank's property, the silver roof glinting through the haze, "is almost a full acre inside your boundary. Whoever filed that newer survey either made a serious mistake or knew exactly what they were doing." He packed his tools slowly, choosing his words. "This won't be an easy fix. Paperwork trumps memory in most counties. But a recorded living marker with corresponding measurements? That's strong evidence." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Just be careful. A man who builds over someone else's land doesn't usually stop at that." That night, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the air itself had changed. The quiet no longer felt neutral. It felt occupied. He could see the faint light from Frank's house blinking through the fog, an intermittent pulse that looked almost deliberate. Every time it flashed, it reflected off the wet leaves of the ash, making it glimmer faintly like a signal. He went outside and stood by the tree for a long time, the damp soil soft under his boots, the smell of rain still fresh. His father's words came back to him then, the ones he hadn't thought about in years. "The land doesn't belong to the loudest man, Tommy. It belongs to the one who remembers it best." The next morning, Hartley called him from the courthouse. He'd found something while checking the filing system, a set of internal notes attached to Frank's survey, referencing a boundary adjustment agreement signed posthumously on behalf of Thomas's father's estate. But Thomas's father had never signed anything like that. He'd been dead 6 years before the date on the form. "Someone forged it," Hartley said quietly. "The signature's a photocopy from an older deed. I can see the artifacts in the scan." Thomas didn't respond at first. He just stood in the kitchen, the phone pressed to his ear, feeling something old and fierce ignite inside him. It wasn't just about property now. Someone had stolen not only his land, but his father's name, twisting it into a tool to justify their theft. That evening, he returned to the ash tree with a lantern and a notebook. He pressed his palm against the bark, rough and cold under his skin, and felt the slow pulse of life within it. He made a promise to himself then, quiet but absolute. He would not let the tree fall, not let the line be rewritten again. The wind moved through the branches with a whispering sound that might have been words or might have been memory, and when he looked toward the barn, he could see Frank standing at the open doorway, watching in silence. Their eyes met across the dim field, the space between them taut as a wire stretched to its limit. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that wasn't already written into the ground beneath their feet. By the end of that week, word had spread through the small farming community that Thomas Coulter was stirring up trouble over property lines again. No one said it to his face, but he could feel it in the way people paused mid-sentence when he entered the feed store, or how conversations seemed to shift direction as soon as he walked by. Rural gossip traveled faster than any machine, and Frank Delaney was a man with reach. He sponsored the church's restoration fund, chaired the grain co-op, and lent equipment to anyone who needed it. To most, he was the kind of neighbor who could do no wrong. Thomas, on the other hand, was the man who came back after years away, quiet and unsociable, the sort who didn't wave at the postman or show up for Sunday potlucks. It didn't matter that his claims were real. The story had already been written for him. Still, the pressure only sharpened his resolve. Frank's next move was quiet, but cruelly effective. One morning, Thomas woke to find new stakes driven into the edge of his field, bright orange plastic caps gleaming like warnings. They ran in a neat, unnatural line, cutting across the soil where the ash tree stood, as if the ground itself had been divided overnight. At first he thought it was another act of intimidation, but when he looked closer, he saw each stake bore a tag printed with a company name: Delaney Agri-Futures, Soil Renewal Project. A note was nailed to the gate at the end of his drive, written on glossy letterhead and signed with Frank's looping hand: Community Demonstration Plot. Approved for testing. Cooperative access granted under temporary jurisdiction. It was the kind of bureaucratic nonsense meant to sound official, but it had no legal basis whatsoever. Still, it was enough to confuse anyone passing by. To them, it looked like Frank had already won. Thomas tore the note down, crumpled it in his hand, and tossed it into the dirt. But the real damage was deeper than humiliation. Later that day, when he checked the ash tree again, he saw that one of its lower branches had been sawed clean off. The cut was fresh, the wood still pale and wet inside. Near the trunk lay the broken remnants of a bird's nest, crushed into the mud. That small, pointless act of destruction did something to him. It stripped away the last restraint he'd been clinging to. He wasn't going to wait for the county's slow paperwork or another polite conversation with men who pretended not to hear him. He needed to act, to mark his land the way his father once had. By hand, with evidence no one could erase. That night, under a moon pale as bone, he brought out a set of wooden posts from the shed and drove them into the soil along the true line. Each strike of the hammer echoed across the empty field, a sound that felt almost ceremonial. He used heavy wire to connect them, stringing it tight enough to hum when plucked. When he reached the last post, near the barn, he saw a small object half buried in the dirt, a canister, its metal casing dull with mud. When he picked it up, he realized it was an empty pesticide sprayer, the kind used for large-scale crop treatment. The nozzle had been broken off, but the chemical residue on his hands stung sharply, burning his skin until he wiped it on his jeans. He recognized the smell at once. Paraquat, a restricted herbicide that could sterilize soil for years if used carelessly. He glanced around the ground and saw faint streaks in the earth, like something had been poured or sprayed along the border. Frank hadn't just moved the line, he was poisoning it. By morning, patches of grass near the ash tree had turned gray, and the lower bark had started to peel. Thomas stood staring at it, disbelief folding slowly into something colder. This wasn't negligence. It was an act of erasure, as deliberate as cutting through a name on a gravestone. He drove into town again, this time to the environmental office, but the official who met him, an overweight man in a wrinkled shirt, listened with the kind of forced patience bureaucrats reserve for hopeless cases. "You'd need proof of application," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Residue testing, photos of active spraying. And since it's your neighbor's land, we'd have to request permission before sampling." The irony of that nearly made Thomas laugh. "So you need the arsonist's permission to check the fire?" he said quietly, but the man only shrugged, typing something into his computer. On the drive back, a fine layer of dust coated the truck's windshield. The air was dry and brittle, the kind that made sound carry far. When he turned onto his road, he saw a group of trucks parked near the entrance to Frank's property. A few men were unloading equipment, measuring rods, a soil auger, and a drone case. Frank stood among them, his posture relaxed, directing them like a foreman. Thomas slowed, rolled down the window, and called out, "What's all this?" Frank looked up, his expression calm, but his eyes bright with challenge. "Demonstration work," he said. "We're testing a new soil compound. Got permits and everything. You'll see improvements to your side, too, if you're lucky." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, searching for any flicker of guilt or shame, but there was nothing. Only the smooth confidence of a man who believed the system bent to his will. That night, the wind shifted again. The smell of chemicals hung faintly in the air, sour and metallic. Thomas sat on the porch with the lights off, watching the faint glow from the neighboring property. Around midnight, the glow flared brighter for a few seconds, the unmistakable flicker of welding sparks from inside the barn. He realized then that Frank wasn't just working with survey lines anymore. He was reinforcing something, preparing for resistance. The thought brought a hollow ache of dread. Yet beneath it, something harder began to form, a resolve shaped by anger and weariness. He retrieved his father's ledger again, turned to the page marked with the ash tree, and traced the old pencil lines with his thumb. The paper was soft, nearly worn through in places, but the mark was still there. Some things, he thought, were too deep to erase. When dawn came, he walked the field again and saw tire marks crossing the outer fence. The gate had been left open, the wire he'd strung the night before torn down. A single post had been ripped out of the soil and lay splintered nearby. On the side facing the barn, someone had carved a rough symbol into it, a half circle with a line through the center. He didn't recognize it, but the message was clear enough. He picked up the post, drove it back into the ground, and hammered it until the echo of steel on wood blended with the call of distant crows. When he finished, sweat stung his eyes, and he looked toward the barn, seeing movement through the upper window, a shadow shifting, then disappearing. Later that day, Hartley the surveyor called again. He'd spoken to the county attorney, who confirmed that the signature on Frank's boundary documents was indeed a duplicate, lifted from an unrelated file. "If you file a claim, we can push this to a hearing," Hartley said, "but you'll need to understand, it won't be private. It'll be messy. Delaney's got influence." Thomas thanked him, but the words barely registered. His focus was already fixed on the horizon, where the barn stood like a monument to theft. He realized there was no avoiding confrontation anymore. The paperwork might catch up someday, but justice, if it was going to mean anything, had to start in the soil. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the ridge, Thomas set up a lantern by the ash tree and sat beside it, waiting. He didn't know what for exactly. Perhaps a sign, perhaps the courage to do what needed to be done. The wind carried the faint scent of fuel from the barn, sharp and acrid, and he thought about how fragile everything was. Borders, names, even the ground under a man's boots. Somewhere in that silence, he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't known in years. Not fear, not anger, but readiness. The hearing took place in the county's administrative building, a flat concrete structure with walls the color of dust and a clock that seemed permanently 5 minutes slow. Thomas had been there once before as a boy, clutching his father's hat while listening to men talk about irrigation rights. But now he entered alone, his hands raw from work and his shirt stiff with starch. The room was long and narrow, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, and at the far end sat a folding table where 3 officials waited with papers spread before them like a deck of cards. Frank was already there, standing near the window, his suit too sharp for the setting, his posture relaxed in a way that made the whole process feel trivial to him. When he turned to face Thomas, there was a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that men wear when they believe the outcome is already decided. Hartley, the surveyor, arrived just before the hearing began, his jacket smelling faintly of rain. He nodded to Thomas, a small gesture of reassurance, and began laying out his equipment, maps, photographs, and the original 1969 record from the historical archive. The proceedings started with dull formalities: property identification, date verification, confirmation of land titles. Thomas barely heard the clerk's voice. His attention was fixed on the sound of the paper sliding, the way the room's silence seemed to thicken every time Frank's lawyer cleared his throat. When it was finally his turn to speak, Frank presented his version of the story with perfect calm. He described Thomas as mistaken, confused, perhaps even resentful after years away. He claimed that all his filings had been approved by the county, that he had followed the legal channels, and that any remaining disputes were the result of outdated markers and poor record-keeping. His voice carried the easy rhythm of someone who had practiced the story until it felt like truth. When Hartley took the stand, the tone shifted. He began by projecting the old survey map on the wall, tracing the original coordinates with a laser pointer. "This," he said, "is the official record from 1969, filed by Harold Coulter and verified by the State Land Registry. It identifies a living boundary marker, an ash tree still standing on site today." He flipped to the next document, a scanned copy of the later survey submitted under Delaney's name. And this, he continued, contains an irregularity. The boundary adjustment agreement attached to this file references Harold Coulter's signature, dated 6 years after his death. The signature itself matches one used on an earlier deed, suggesting it was copied electronically. In legal terms, that constitutes document falsification. The words landed like hammer blows in the quiet room. For a moment, Frank didn't move. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something too low to hear, but Hartley continued, explaining the soil and GPS analysis he had conducted the week prior. The barn, he said, extended nearly 1 acre over the Coulter property line, and the concrete poured around the missing boundary stone contained traces of modern polymer additives, materials not available at the time the structure was built. That concrete, Hartley said, was poured recently, within the past 2 years. The statement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. One of the officials leaned forward, frowning, and asked Frank directly whether he wished to dispute the findings. For the first time since the hearing began, Frank's composure faltered. His jaw tightened, his fingers tapped once against the table, and then he said quietly that he had no comment until further review. Thomas didn't smile, didn't even breathe properly. He simply watched the man who had stolen his father's land begin to unravel under the weight of fact. The board recessed briefly, the 3 officials leaving to deliberate, and in that short silence, Frank turned toward him. "You think this changes anything?" he said under his breath. "You'll still lose. I've built something real here. You can't erase it." Thomas looked at him for a long moment before replying, "Neither could you." When the board returned, their decision was brief and direct. The boundary adjustment was declared invalid, the forged document entered as evidence for criminal review, and the ownership of the disputed acre restored to the Coulter estate. Frank was ordered to remove all structures encroaching beyond the original survey line within 60 days, and the county would oversee the process to ensure compliance. The decision was read in a monotone, but each sentence carried a weight Thomas felt in his bones. The room fell silent except for the scratching of pens and the faint hum of the lights. When it ended, Frank left without another word, his lawyer trailing behind him, while Thomas remained seated, staring at the map projected on the wall, the line restored, the tree's mark visible again. Outside, the afternoon light was harsh and white, the air dry as bone. Hartley clapped him on the shoulder once before heading to his truck, leaving Thomas standing alone at the top of the courthouse steps. Across the street, a group of pigeons scattered suddenly, startled by something unseen, and the moment felt strangely symbolic, as though the air itself had shifted back into balance. When he drove home, the road seemed narrower but clearer, the fields on either side stretching wide and gold beneath the lowering sun. As he approached his property, he saw that the ash tree still stood untouched, its branches lifting slightly in the breeze like a hand raised in quiet acknowledgement. The barn in the distance looked smaller now, diminished not by distance but by truth. Thomas parked the truck, stepped out, and walked across the field until his boots sank into the same earth that had once been taken from him. For the first time in years, he felt the ground hold his weight without resistance, as if the land itself was exhaling, welcoming him back. In the weeks that followed, the noise of dismantling became the new sound of mourning. From his porch, Thomas could hear the metallic groan of machinery, the whine of drills, and the rhythmic clang of hammers striking steel as workers stripped the roof from Frank's barn piece by piece. Each sound carried across the field like an echo of justice, slow, methodical, and undeniable. He didn't go over to watch closely. He didn't need to. The sight of the structure shrinking day by day was enough. Sometimes, when the wind carried voices from the crew, he caught fragments of their talk, ordinary and indifferent, the language of men doing a job that wasn't theirs to question. By the end of the second week, the barn was half gone, the skeletal beams exposed like bones bleached by sun. When the final section came down, the air smelled of dust and wet earth, and the space it left behind felt strangely open, almost fragile, as if the ground was remembering how to breathe again. Frank didn't speak to him after the ruling. He moved out quietly, or perhaps just retreated to another part of his land, leaving the fields unworked and the gate padlocked. The orange stakes disappeared, the signs were taken down, and for the first time since Thomas's return, no artificial lines cut across the soil. The county crew came to mark the restored boundary, planting a new stone marker beside the ash tree, smaller than the original, but solid. Thomas watched them finish the work, then stayed after they left, running his hand along the cool surface of the stone. He noticed how the evening light fell across it, casting a shadow that stretched perfectly straight toward the horizon. The air was still, except for the sound of insects beginning their low chorus in the grass. When he looked toward the tree, he saw new shoots sprouting from the cut where the branch had been severed, tender and bright against the darker bark. The sight filled him with a quiet relief that went deeper than satisfaction. It wasn't triumph he felt, but balance, the simple restoration of something that had been bent out of shape and finally allowed to settle. He rolled the old boundary wire he had found months earlier into a neat coil and placed it at the base of the marker, not as a relic, but as a promise that the land would remember. That evening, he took the tractor out for the first time in months. It started on the second turn of the key, the engine coughing once before finding its rhythm, the deep, steady hum of something old but alive. He drove slowly along the perimeter of the field, tracing the edge of what was his, the air warm with the scent of soil and grass. As the sun dipped lower, its light burned through the dust, turning the horizon into a band of molten gold. When he reached the ash tree, he stopped the tractor and cut the engine. The silence that followed was immense, the kind of silence that didn't ask for anything. He sat there for a long time, hands resting on the wheel, watching the tree's leaves shift gently in the evening breeze. It stood there exactly where his father had planted it, unmovable, alive, and finally at peace, marking not just the end of a boundary, but the beginning of his own.